Morning, everyone. Just under the wire. Hopefully, I get it in on time. But here's a Maxime Bernier Twitter roundup. It's been a little while since I've done one, so here we go. Maxime Bernier tweeting, quote, Trudeau's carbon tax will have zero impact on the climate. It's just another giant scheme to redistribute wealth and buy votes, which makes these reminders sent to 7 million household liberal political ads paid by the taxpayer. And I would agree with that. I reported on this the other day. $1 million of your taxpayer dollars going to remind people to tick that box and get their carbon tax. Is that what you want your tax money going to? I certainly don't. Maxime Bernier tweeting again. Banning anonymity may lower the level of abuse, but it also means online identity police, cracking down on those with false identities, making it easier to control speech, etc. In short, more control and censorship, less freedom, when you can simply mute typical libcon stuff. And this is in response to Aaron O'Toole tweeting, quote, I respect Minister at Kath McKenna and enjoy debating with her. I have to say, I hate to see some of the abuse she and others are subject to on social media. We do need to do better. I think ending anonymous accounts on Twitter would be a good start. Right. And I talked about that then. The Canadian government has zero jurisdiction on Twitter. The Canadian government has zero jurisdiction on Facebook. They had subpoenas for these people for House sessions, hearings, and they were ignored. So, I mean, it's kind of funny. And again, you can't. No, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole again. I've talked about it before. Maxime Bernier is tweeting again. Listen to my interview with @AB Danielle Smith. We discuss climate alarmism, how Andrew Scheer is splitting the Libcon vote and getting rid of the deficit in 2 years, and abortion. And the next one. Yes, we know, and this is in response to Scheer's big policy reveals are a lot like Trudeau's. Yeah, they really are. Here is the Star, and there's a link in the description if you want to read it. It was posted May 30th, and it says, quote, Conservative leader Andrew Scheer is in the middle of rolling out what he calls, quote, my vision for Canada. It's a series of 5 speeches, 3 of which he has already given, that are supposed to lay out his views on everything from the economy to immigration. That he is doing so 5 months before the federal election is not surprising, but what is striking in this age of right-wing populism is how orthodox Scheer's stated views seem. There's not a hint of Trumpism in the speeches he has given, no anti-immigrant nativism, no critique of what Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland has called the post-war liberal consensus. Indeed, at base, Scheer's idea of how Canada should operate seems eerily similar to those of Liberal Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Like Trudeau, Scheer's a fan of free trade. He supports the North American Free Trade Agreement and its recently negotiated successor, the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, or the USMCA, which is how it's called in United States and Mexico. He supports the 11-nation comprehensive progressive agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership that the Liberal government signed. He may complain now about the manner in which the Trudeau government negotiated those pacts. He suggests, without being specific, that he could have done better, but is not dissatisfied enough to call for their revocation. On the home front, Scheer blasts the Trudeau government for running fiscal deficits, but like Trudeau, he is in no hurry to eliminate them. In fact, his promise to phase out the $20 billion deficit over 5 years mirrors the pledge that Trudeau made, but didn't keep in 2015. Scheer says that he would keep the Liberals' pricey new Canada child benefit if his party wins power this fall. He's also promised not to cut seniors' benefits or transfer to provinces for programs such as healthcare. He would scrap Liberals' new Canada Infrastructure Bank, a mysterious entity that so far has accomplished little. And he has promised to end the practice of subsidizing billion-dollar companies. The latter is a promise easily made in opposition, but more difficult to maintain in government, particularly when hundreds of jobs are on the line. In foreign affairs, Scheer, like Trudeau, would side with like-minded liberal democracies. Like Trudeau, he would confront Russia. Like Trudeau, he would encourage the U.S. to maintain a strong presence in the world. The Conservative leader is harshly critical of Trudeau's approach to China, particularly in light of Beijing's seemingly unwarranted jailing of Canadians Michael Korvig and Michael Spavor. But he doesn't say what he would do differently to facilitate their release. Like Trudeau, Scheer would deal with worsening Canada-China trade relations by seeking other markets in Asia. The Conservative leader is calling for a, quote, total reset of Canada's relationship with China. He does not, however, specify exactly what this would mean. On immigration, Scheer and Trudeau are more in step than either would like to admit. Like the Liberal Prime Minister, Scheer says immigrants are an economic necessity for Canada. He criticizes the government for failing to reduce the number of refugee claimants who use loopholes in Canada-U.S. Safe Third Country Agreement to enter Canada illegally. His answer is to negotiate a change in the agreement, which is exactly what the Trudeau government has been trying to do. I scroll down. With this quintet of speeches, Scheer hopes to set the record straight. He's neither a hardliner nor a nut. Truth be told, his views are a lot like Trudeau's. Interesting article. And there's a lot I agree with. I would say that, I don't know, this last little bit maybe could be massaged, but whatever. But interesting, right? Interesting to note. Here's Bernier again, saying, Philip Cross is absolutely right. The real fascists are the increasingly intolerant and authoritarian left. Yeah, I looked at this article as well, and I left it in the description, but it was a little dense for me to read. I'll leave it here as well. You can have a read for yourself. I thought it was interesting. And Maxime Bernier is tweeting again, 2018-19 deficit is 11.8 billion. Tory at Pierre Poilievre says it could have easily been much smaller if Liberals had not spent like crazy. Like what, $8 billion? Then he defends Scheer's decision to eliminate it in 5 instead of 2 years because, quote, mess is bigger than we thought. What a joker. And this is Global Politics reporting on Ottawa's deficit. The next tweet is, we've had decades now of historical predictions, followed by never mind when they are belied by facts, along with vicious demonization and ostracization of scientists who question the dominant narrative of catastrophic anthropogenic global warming. That's human caused. And this is climate change versus climate change is a political loser. And this is frontpagemag.com. And here's the article. Climate change is a political loser. Ooh, that's a big picture. Here we go. First came Donald Trump's stunning victory in 2016 after a campaign in which he rejected scientific consensus on catastrophic anthropogenic global warming, CAGW, and proved true to his rhetoric by withdrawing the U.S. from the Paris Climate Accords. Then a few years later, France was rocked by the Yellow Vests movement that started with protests, again, attacks on fuel that President Emmanuel Macron, in true globalist technocratic fashion, proposed as a way to nudge the masses into using less of the carbon-based energy allegedly heating the planet. And now comes Australia, where, contrary to the predictions of the globalist elite, the anti-carbon progressive who had proposed job-killing regulations to cut carbon emissions in half by 2030 failed to defeat the conservative incumbent who would rather save jobs than, quote, save the planet. Climate change is looking like a losing election issue. The global technocrats, for whom climate change has been one of those crises that progressives, quote, never let go to waste, no doubt are wishing they could dissolve the people rather than change the government through democratic elections. Persuading free citizens with arguments based on fact or with appeals to their interests is difficult when your, quote, crisis is nothing more than a politicized hypothesis based on appeals to authority, rigged computer simulations, and apocalyptic predictions laced with insults to skeptics' intelligence and morals. The politicians should have seen the signs of global warming's declining unity as an electoral scare tactic. In the U.S., quote, climate change for years has ranked low on the list of issues voters are concerned about. Before last year's midterm elections, in a Gallup poll, climate change ranked next to last of 12 issues that voters judge extremely or very important, just above investigating Russian interference in the 2016 election. Of course, people will tell a pollster that they're concerned and think something should be done about climate change because they've been told that that's what the right people think. But when it comes to election day, most will vote for a growing economy, wage increases, more jobs, lower taxes, and few federal nurse ratchets trying to cram more social or environmental justice pills down their throats. Moreover, we've had decades now of hysterical predictions, followed by never mind when they are belied by facts, along with the vicious demonization and ostracization of scientists who question the dominant narrative of CAGW. The hypocrisy of this very unscientific demand for unquestioned obedience, not to a scientific fact, but to a working hypothesis, has now become blatantly obvious. Real science, which is usually reluctant to claim it's settled, works quite the opposite. As philosopher Karl Popper defined it, quote, the method of science is the method of bold conjectures and ingenious and severe attempts to refute them. I scroll down a little bit. Even a layman with practical wisdom can see the purveyors of, quote, climate change who make such ad hominem attacks and invent a consensus are up to no good. There's also the hinky marketing decision to switch global warming to climate change, a substitution forced by the 2 decades hiatus and significant rise in temperature, even as emissions of CO2 increased by gigatons. Or there's the implicit claim that CO2, which makes up 0.04% of the atmosphere can override the sun as the prime factor in global climate change. Selling that is going to require much more definite and complete, truly scientific, not sciencey, explanation of how global climate, with its numerous systems and subsystems and intricate feedback loops, works before we gauge or gouge the world's economy for trillions of dollars. The fact is, too much of global warming science is still speculative and provisional, while the gaps in knowledge, such as the precise role of water vapor, are filled with assumptions, then that when plugged into a computer simulation just happen to always confirm the CAGW hypothesis. Other questionable practices, from manipulated weather station data to graphs designed to hide the decline in temperatures over time, are more evidence that something other than real science is at work. So too does the media's silencing of counter-arguments and contrary evidence that challenge the CAGW orthodoxy. For example, climatologist Judith Curry, Chair Emerita of the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at the Georgia Institute of Technology, has questioned the narrative that CO2 increases consistently track with temperature increases. As City Journal's Guy Sorman reports, Curry, quote, tells me, for example, that between 1910 and 1940, the planet warmed during a climactic episode that resembles our own, down to the degree. The warming can't be blamed on industry, she argues, because back then, most of the carbon dioxide emissions from burning fossil fuels were small. In fact, Curry says, almost half of the warming observed in the 20th century came about in the first half of the century, before carbon dioxide emissions became large. If we had an honest media reporting both sides of the debate, instead of shilling for one, we would hear more about such challenges to the consensus and more re-examination of the empirical evidence presented and as support for its claims. Instead, the executive summaries, i.e. selectively edited, of research from the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, are widely breathlessly reported, despite the long record of computer model projections of future temperatures being out of line with actual temperature data. Yeah. Finally, the most damning evidence of CAGW duplicity is that even if it was correct, all the expensive solutions to the problem ballyhooed at global warming inked conventions like the Paris Climate Accords would not even begin to solve the problem, as environmentalist Bjorn Lomborg points out in the Wall Street Journal. The IPCC says carbon emissions need to peak right now and fall rapidly to avert catastrophe. Models actually reveal that to achieve the 2.7 degree goal, the world must stop all fossil fuel use in less than 4 years. Yet, the International Energy Agency estimates that in 2040, fossil fuels will still meet 3/4 of world energy needs, even if the Paris Agreement is fully implemented. The UN body responsible for the Accord estimates that if every country fulfills every pledge by 2030, CO2 emissions will be cut by 60 billion tons by 2030. That's less than 1% of what is needed to keep temperature rise below 2.7 degrees. And achieving that, even that fraction, would be vastly expensive, reducing worldwide growth 1 trillion to 2 trillion each year by 2030. Wow. Are your eyebrows above your hairline? Mine too. Here's back to the article. Indeed, the weakness of the CAGW consensus suggests not a scientific activity, but a nature worship cult attached to a lucrative scam that is worth billions in research grants and green energy pork. Or maybe a mental illness, as geologist Dr. Norman Page surmises. Quote, a very large majority of established academic climate scientists have succumbed to a virulent infectious disease, the CO2 derangement syndrome. Those afflicted by this syndrome present with a spectrum of symptoms. The first is an almost total inability to recognize the most obvious millennial and 60-year emergent patterns, which are trivially obvious in solar activity and global temperature data. In other words, focused as they are on the satanic mills of the industrial age, the wicked destroyer of the planet for the last 150 years, they ignore the longer patterns of climate change associated with the sun. I thought that was worth going through because, yeah, the other side is never brought up in the news, never at all. And it's interesting because there's not a lot of data to support the global warming hypothesis. It's interesting to note. Here's another tweet from Mr. Bernier. He says, we only have 10 years to save the planet from global warming, or there will be ecological disasters. The polar ice caps will melt and entire nations will be wiped out. It will be too late if we don't reverse the warming trend before 2000. Yeah, I've shown this too. Lots. And yeah, it was alarmist back then. It's just as alarmist now because it is. Here's Maxime on Dave Rubin. Dave at Dave Rubin Report got it right. And Dave Rubin says the reason everyone is going bananas about politics is because of the massive realignment that's currently taking place. It's basically everyone, conservatives, libertarians, independents, old school liberals, small like center liberals, small L liberals, I suppose, or small C conservatives, versus progressive authoritarians and their media cohorts. Game on. Yeah, yep. And here's another one. Ezra Levant, Andrew Scheer submits to the UN global warming agenda. I will admit I haven't read this yet. I just didn't want to be accused of editing Mr. Bernier's tweets and not including one that he tweeted out with Ezra. So there it is. He tweeted something with Ezra Levant. Oh no, here's Mr. Bernier's climate policy. He says, quote, given the uncertainties over the scientific basis of global warming and the certainties about the huge costs of measures designed to fight it, there is no compelling reason to jeopardize our prosperity with more government interventions. And this is a link to the People's Party platform. And if you want an in-depth look at that platform, have a look at my local channel. I do an in-depth look on it today, actually, after lunch. I'm getting hungry. Yeah, after lunch. I'm not sure if I'm going to get this in for morning. Sorry, everyone. And the last tweet for this morning, maybe I will. The last tweet for this morning is, war is peace. Freedom is slavery. Ignorance is strength. Diversity is our strength. Diversity is a product of our strengthy blah, 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 freedomy blah, blah, blah. George Orwell, with some help from Justin Trudeau and Andrew Scheer. And yeah, really, like this is Andrew Scheer's quote. Diversity is a product of our strength, and our strength is and ever has been our freedom. I think diversity plus proximity plus what Justin Trudeau has done to our legal system, well, there are examples in recent history of what happens when you pack a powder keg full and then swing a match nearby, to light a cigarette or whatever you're doing, standing near that powder keg. Mr. Scheer, Mr. Trudeau, right? And then you can use that disaster. Well, you never let a good crisis go to waste, right? As we heard earlier in the video today. So I think that it's interesting to note the similarities between Mr. Scheer and Mr. Trudeau, the lib cons at full strength. And I think that it's interesting to note that we have one person on the federal stage who's bringing all of this to light. And I think it's interesting to note the amount of opposition that is happening on Twitter, on other social media networks, everywhere. It's really interesting to note. And if you're not noting it, if you think, yeah, our side's winning, you might need to open your ears. You might need to get strong and be ready to hear the other side of an argument. Because at the beginning of this, we talked about how all through the world and every single province in the last year has been electing right-wing governments. And I'm not interested in authoritarianism at all. I'm interested in having good governance for Canada and making sure that we're not sending all of our riches and resources all over the world while our citizens in our country are left on the sidelines because some, I don't know, cabal of media and whatever are drumming these marching orders and extracting our money, extracting our taxes and saying, no, it's good for you. It's good for you to send all of your money to, or your garbage to China. It's good for you to do that. It's a reduction in CO2 to pack all of your garbage onto shipping containers and send it across the sea to China. Watch my local channel this afternoon for a deep dive into Mr. Bernier's policy today. Thank you for watching. Check out the peoplespartyofcanada.ca because, man, it really is, I think, the only option for Canada this year. Thanks for watching. Have a wonderful day.